Howdy, it's me. I am finally back with more content. So last time I made a video, it was, I believe, over 2 weeks ago now, and it was about who the Roaring Knight was. And a quick side note before getting into the rest of today's topic, I will be trying to follow a more consistent schedule from now on, and that means I will be likely posting Mother videos on Wednesdays and Undertale and Deltarune videos on Fridays. So I thank you for your time, and now back to the video. So in the thumbnail, I did not make an error. We are not trying to think of what happens next in Deltarune. I am trying to think of what will happen now. Now specifically because of the fact that a lot of different theories on what might happen next have sort of been whittled away. And I think that there is one very solid path that Deltarune may take going forward. Now, this video will not be focusing much on the weird rat at all, although I may try to get into it later on. And first, I will be trying to go over crack theories that I have just seen across the rest of YouTube and Reddit and whatnot right now about Deltarune. The first I'd like to go over is none other than our favorite captain of the, SS Deltarune, Captain Weird Deer de Gaster. Now, do I believe he is a pirate? No. Do I believe it is funny to, just occasionally say, "Chips ahoy, you land lovers"? I do really feel like land lighteners would be better, but it's still hilarious either way. Next theory, that Gaster is green. Now, while I do think that, since Papyrus is red and Sans is blue, this heavily depends on the original interpretation that we have from Undertale, circa 2015, 2016, that Gaster just has to be like the third skeleton brother, or, Papyrus and Sans' long estranged father that occasionally shows up in the background of a few fan games. Next crack theory isn't really a crack theory at all. It is something that people have talked about for a while, more as a joke, and that is, my name? It's Susie Gaster. Yeah, about that. I heavily doubt that Susie would really be the child of good old Wingdings Gaster, but heavy on the butt there. I don't think it's a joke, really, like everyone else says, because if we think back to Undertale, at Fun Value 81, Clamgirl states that even though the protagonist, Frisk, has never met her neighbor's child, Suzy spelled S-U-Z-Y, that the time we would meet her is fast approaching. Now, think of it this way. Clamgirl is also shown to be a goner, right? I don't really know if anybody's ever proposed that Susie herself could be a goner. Now, you have people like Spooky Dude, for example, who has theorized that, more specifically than a goner, that Chris is the vessel, or Cammy Boy G, who has said that pre-chapters 3 and 4 releasing, that Rouse might be a goner. Now, I feel like that nobody has really given Susie the same amount of, investigation into whether or not she could have a goner counterpart, because I feel like there is a lot of evidence towards her possibly having one, especially considering the fact that in Chapter 1, and likely before it, she was very closed off, she was very isolated. We don't even know if she does have a home at all. She is living in the dark world after all. For all we know, that she could have ran away from home, or her parents could have abandoned her, or something like that. And I think this is really where we need to think about, okay, maybe she had also lost hope in some sort of way and became a goner. Or at least, had a goner counterpart made. Because it seems sort of like if she did have a goner counterpart, she might be part of the whole, hometown cult for the greater good sort of thing. But, I still think that she did have, a sense of hopelessness and maybe despair at the fact that, she later says to Chris in the beginning of Chapter 1, nobody can choose who they are in this world. Since we're already on the topic of goners, I'd like to go over two other very close and connected theories. The first one is that Chris is a goner. I believe that there's a lot of evidence towards this, with the whole, being colored in with love and whatnot. And also the fact that if we look at Chris at the beginning of Chapter 5, they seem to have lost a lot of color. Sort of like without the soul, they start to revert to, that grayscale goner form. Now, there is another counterpart to this theory known as Cressel, or the Chris is the vessel theory. That the whole nobody can choose who they are in this world thing is meant to sort of be towards us, because the fact that we try to make our vessel, and then all of a sudden, that vessel became Chris. that Chris became Chris because Chris was always Chris. They were going to be who they were going to be, and even if they had player intervention, they still would have became Chris. Which I do like that theory. I do like it a lot. And I think that Cressel is one of those things that's either going to be, completely true, that sort of like Spooky Dude had in the bag, just like he figured that one out before Tricky Tony was able to put that in the game, or it could just be a completely incorrect thing that gets blown up in chapter 6 or 7. Now, do I really think that Cressel or Chris is a goner could be true? Yeah, I mean, it's a basically a coin flip, really. Or they could just be a normal human. And now here's for some older Deltarune fandom stuff. Is Chris meant to be a stand-in for Kara? Are they meant to be a stand-in for Frisk? Are they meant to be a sort of weird, fusion of the two? Or are they just a completely separate character from Frisk and Kara? Now, I believe that, if anything, that Chris would likely be sort of the grown-up version of Frisk. And I know this is a very common interpretation of that all, though I feel like the evidence is just too overwhelming, especially with the whole name anagram. I mean, if you literally just make it so that, Chris's middle name begins with an F, then it's Chris F. Dreamer, Chris becomes a literal anagram of Frisk. But on the other hand, I mean, there's also the fact that Chris F. Dreamer is an anagram for Murderer Frisk, so who knows? Chris could be the evil version of Frisk all along, just like what we thought in Chapter 1. They're going to pull a genocide on the hometown. It's all over. It's Undertale all over again. But really, is it? I mean, if we're thinking about this seriously, Chris is probably either Frisk or just another, silent protagonist human that Toby wanted to make for a story. And we also have to take into account that Chris came first when it came to, Toby's creation of the characters. Toby Fox was creating Deltarune first, then scrapped the project for Deltarune, and then made that into Undertale. Only after Undertale took off did he decide to go back and remake Deltarune. In fact, the reflection of Frisk in Waterfall can still be seen as a vaguely Chris-looking sprite with the yellow shirt and the shadowed over eyes, with the bangs creating the shadow. Now, I believe this is probably just some sort of leftover artifact from Deltarune's early creation back from, 2012 or whenever Toby started trying to really start building Deltarune before he sort of turned it into Undertale. Because I believe that Undertale, if you look at it, the old features, it even had that little bar that we now see for TP, tension points. In early drafts, Frisk was even sort of a warrior, too. I think that, if anything, Frisk is more inspired by Chris than Chris is inspired by Frisk. So really, based off of that, I don't think Chris is a goner or maybe even the vessel, just because of the fact that Chris seems to, be a human and, not a goner or, the vessel, which is probably just sitting in the meat factory under Hometown. On a side note, I also believe that the demon that Chris summoned when they were younger might actually be Kara, if anything, because Kara is the demon who comes when you call its name. So, if anything, what about the genocide route of where we sold Kara our soul? Which would explain why, the red soul, the player soul, is now in the world of Deltarune, which now we control the player soul still, and it's now residing in Chris because Chris did something, I don't know what, and maybe Kara was just like, hey kid, take the soul. For all we know, we could even be playing as Kara. And we're actually probably just playing as the player, or just as the angel in general. Wait a second. Is Kara trying to make us the angel? Because back in Undertale, if you remember, there is still the Deltarune prophecy that claims the angel will fall into the underground and will empty it. Now, this has two meanings because, on the pacifist route, it's first breaking the barrier, so everyone is now freed, and then on the genocide route, it's, the underground is cleared because of genocide. Everyone is gone because the player killed everyone. So, we also can basically get based off their plan that Kara wanted to sacrifice themselves to sort of allow Azrael to take their soul and then cross the barrier so he could gather another 6 human souls and then also break the barrier. What if Kara was trying to make themselves the angel the entire time, and now in Deltarune they have the chance to be the angel? And if Deltarune is really some sort of weird prequel that also has sequel tie-ins through Gaster and Kara, perhaps Kara is trying to become the angel so they can go back and, I don't know, free the underground. Oh my god, what am I talking about? This is insane. This goes beyond crack theory. Sorry, people. Let's move on to who the knight might be. Because after Chapter 5, it seems that nobody can agree who the Roaring Knight is anymore. First of all, I'd like to start with Carol Knight. And Carol Knight, well, I'd honestly just suggest the Shabunka video where she sort of goes over the fact that it really wouldn't make sense for Carol to be the knight if you think about it, because of the fact that, why would she be helping out Asgore by funding him while he's running his investigation into the Roaring Knight, whom he wants to, kill, and then basically parade the body of through town once he kills the Roaring Knight. If she's the Roaring Knight, why would she want that to happen? And this also sort of rule out Rudy Knight, because why would Carol want Asgore to, well, kill Rudy? I mean, sure, the guy's basically already dead, and I'm putting it out there, the guy probably did not leave the hospital after Chapter 5, but I still kind of would see it a bit suspicious if, just Carol didn't know, or, was just hiring Asgore as a detective to investigate it all, since she was the knight anyway. But even then, it also wouldn't make sense, because didn't the knight appear after Des had already went missing, like shortly after? So that would not make any sense whatsoever, because that would imply that Rudy or Carol were already the knight by the time that, well, Des went missing, which is sort of against the whole, well, Carol or Rudy want to find their daughter, so they're the knights. And then there's the theory that I saw pop up one time of, what if Des's disappearance was just like sort of plotted beforehand, and Des purposefully disappeared, sort of based off that discrepancy in Noelle's dialogue in the Weird Route, the fact that Des left versus Des disappeared. Now, there was always the chance that Carol was just hiring Asgore to document the disappearances more as a way for her to control the evidence and make sure it's tainted, so, nobody in Hometown, not even Asgore, could try to interfere with her plans, which, whatever they are, we don't currently know. Now, another common theory lately has been Crystal Knight, which I fiercely believe is not true. Mainly because of the fact that would make so many of the different details in the Deltarune timeline extremely, construed and whatnot, because of the fact that canonically the Weird Route would have had to happen at one point, and the Weird Route is very obviously not the norm for what is supposed to happen in Deltarune. I mean, we can already see this. It seems that the Weird Route seems to be a sort of gamble to break the prophecy quicker and more efficiently. I mean, that's one of the possibilities of what it is, but this also, for the Weird Route, seems to be leaning towards more of a, what happens when the player oversteps their boundaries, what happens when you intentionally try to break a game by disregarding all of its set rules and just trying to sort of, use that grind mindset you find, which is sort of exploited in the Undertale genocide route, to just detach from the characters and the actual desired emotional tone of the game itself. You just sort of have to disregard everything that the creator wanted you to feel about the game, and you're instead turning it into, how much XP can I get? How many levels can I get? How can I make my characters get stronger? Hence, Noelle got stronger. That is seemingly the intended message of the Weird Route of Deltarune. And I feel like if the whole reason for the Weird Route was just to set up the Knight's existence, because apparently the Knight is some weird hybrid amalgamate of Chris and Noelle, I feel like that'd have a lot of wasted potential for the meta-narrative aspect of Deltarune. Then there's the idea that the Vessel is the Knight, which honestly is a pretty interesting idea. I mean, especially considering the fact that the Knight and Chris share so many different mannerisms, which I guess could be carried over, though the problem is the vessel was meant to literally be an empty vessel for us to inhabit. The vessel does not have any sort of set personality. Their personality is whatever we give it, however we play as. Chris is the one with the personality, and that's why you see Chris having all the different, mannerisms. I doubt if the vessel was the Roaring Knight, the vessel would somehow have enough of a personality to think, yes, I'm going to Aura Farm and just frustrate Susie to no end because I am, I'm this big, epic, cool bad guy that's in the prophecy. And honestly, Death's Knight would make sense more the more I think about it, because if Deltarune is meant to be Undertale's parallel story, think of it this way. Death's and Azrael would be sort of parallels because you have Flowey become the Knight and then Azrael become Death's. And so, sort of at the end, the Knight would be unmasked and go back to being Death's, just like how in Undertale, Flowey was transformed back into Azrael at the final part in the plot of the True Pacifist route. Of course, Death's younger sibling is Noelle, and then Azrael's younger sibling was Kara. So I feel like what might be happening here is the weird route can be compared to the genocide route of Undertale, as we have sort of corrupted Noelle as you sort of corrupt Kara in the genocide route of Undertale. And both gain awareness not just of, the player character in either games, in Undertale, Frisk, and in Deltarune, Chris. They seem to know that the player as a force exists, with Kara basically, taking over from you, and then Noelle sort of based off the fact that she can tell that Chris's voice, specifically in the weird route, has gotten this weird static, almost like it's being broadcasted from a speaker, sort of added effect to it, like it isn't Chris's normal voice. Their voice isn't normally like that. So Noelle is sort of unique in the fact that she can tell that the player is somehow interfering. She doesn't necessarily know that the player exists. However, she knows that something is very wrong, and there's some sort of outside voice that gives Chris the power to no longer be a Chris. Just like how she wants the power to no longer be a Noelle. Oh, and another topic, the whole Deltarune 3 routes theory. Now, I do believe that there is a third route of Deltarune. You have your normal route. I'm assuming that the pacifist version of that is going to have a different ending than the rest of it. You have your true weird route, which I believe is the, what's going to happen is you come back in Chapter 7, of course, because that's what's going to happen because of the whole Chapter 7 Side B thing. And then you have your aborted weird route, which I'm going to be calling from now on the sword routes. Do you want to know why I'm going to be calling it the sword route? Because if we think back to that video game little thing for ERAM in Chapter 3, Noelle and Chris, or at least the little, bit forms that you've seen in the minigame, they are still around, they are still moving around in that minigame. So I believe that this may, instead of following the normal weird route, this may be following the aborted weird route. And what may happen here is, because of the fact that we still have Noelle, we still have that weapon, though she isn't fully woken up yet, she still thinks it's all a dream. Once Susie tells her the truth of the dark world, that means that we will be able to reassume control over Noelle in a similar fashion to what we had before, but this time she will not be attempting to go across the lake, which means now we can actually stay in hometown and, just like in the sword route, get stronger by, using Snowgrave on other Lightners. And that is why I believe that the aborted weird route will be the route that is foretold in the Chapter 3 minigame for the sword route. Now, please excuse me for the fact that I do not use a script whatsoever, so I am just, going off on unorganized and often unorthodox tangents about the random theories that will pop into my head. Though, this one is a very important theory to me that I just sort of figured out a while ago, and so hold on with me here as I go through this explanation. In another series, Five Nights at Freddy's, there is a substance known as agony, and yes, I know it is probably one of the most divisive things in all of it. But agony is this sort of supernatural substance that is made from the collective, just negative emotions of either, multiple people or just one extremely tormented individual. And where I think that this may come in here is, Hometown has obviously had a lot of grief, especially with the Holiday family, with concerning December's disappearance, Rudy's health condition, and also the Dreamer family, because you have the fact that, Toriel and Asgore divorced, and that probably was not the best for Azriel and Chris, emotionally speaking. So what if the night is sort of the culmination of all of the negative emotions of the townsfolk, the people of hometown, and it's distilled into this, shadowy night presence that is unspearable. You have to fight it, and there's no reasoning with it. It's just you have to fight it. Sort of like the culmination of all negative emotions would be like. The culmination of all negative emotions would be an inherently negative force. It would not be reasoned with. It could not be sparable. It would have to be fought because it would only keep fighting. Now, I don't really see any problem with this theory other than the fact that, well, it would make the night less spot relevant, and then it would also make it so why is Carol sort of affiliating with this, negative supernatural presence that is, the culmination of her grief and trauma over December's disappearance, and the fact that her husband is currently terminally ill and likely won't even make it much longer. I mean, quick side tangent real quick. I don't really know if Rudy is dead yet. He might be dead, he might not be dead. As far as we know, he could have just tripped and fell and, was completely fine. But, I don't know, Carol just called Noelle anyways, but I think it's more likely that Rudy, if anything, will die in Chapter 6, after all the story is getting a bit darker. But, back to what I call Agony Night theory. This would set up the perfect, unsparable, unredeemable enemy that would really subvert what we all expect from Toby Fox so far, because everybody in his stories is usually redeemable. Everyone always has a brighter side about them. Now, a final hypothesis, well, it's not even a hypothesis really, it's more of an observation that I've made over the last few days about chapters 1 through 5 as a whole of Deltarune. It's that for some reason, the normal route and the weird route have sort of opposite effects on specifically Susie and Noelle. For Noelle, in the normal route, she slowly becomes more and more sort of, I guess, lucid, while Susie becomes more and more ingrained in the escapism that is the dark world. However, on the weird route, for some reason, it is Noelle who slowly becomes more and more entrenched in the dream that is the dark world, specifically her player intervening trauma from the weird route itself when it comes to her becoming stronger, while Susie doesn't seem to fully be engrossing herself in all of the, escapism of the dark worlds and seems to be a lot more focused on what is happening in the real world, unlike Noelle in that route. And I think this may be an intentional narrative foiling by Toby Fox in an attempt to sort of show us just how strange and off that we are making the world of Deltarune itself by proceeding down the weird route. And a quick side note before I want to go on to the next section of this video. I would like to discuss a very tumultuous thing in the community currently, and that would be the gender debates surrounding Chris and Rouse. So, we're going to cover Rouse first, because I feel like this is the most important. There is no concrete evidence of a trans femme Rouse besides the whole little princess skit in Chapter 5, and also the fact that Flowery calls Rouse a princess, but he also calls everyone else princess, so I don't really know if that's very applicable. And even if there were more evidence, I still really would be against the idea of referring to somebody by the pronouns that they do not currently go by. I kind of feel like even if Rouse does, transition over to being female, I do not feel like we should already jump the gun and assume he necessarily even will right now before we even have confirmation of that. That just kind of feels a bit wrong to me. If Rouse does end up transitioning, I have no problem with that. If Rouse does not, I also have no problem with that. I just feel like we should still refer to him as, he is Rouse, not anything else. I mean, even the one dialogue in the menu, watering their own vines, Notice how their own vines are plural, that could literally just be the plural they and not the singular they. And honestly, at the end of the day, we still won't know if Rouse will indeed transition until it's either confirmed or it just, until the very end of the story, Rouse is still the prince from the dark. And now let's move on to Chris, who very clearly throughout the story has been presented as non-binary, like every single time that they have been referred to. Actually, I don't understand how people can repeatedly make the same mistake that Chris is a boy or Chris is a girl, because Chris, I'm just putting it out there, has been constantly stated to be, going by they, them pronouns. Now, I do understand for people from other countries, like I take Spanish in school currently. I know that is a very gendered language, for example, and that, you have el for masculine words, and then you have la for feminine words, and then even at the end of adjectives, you still have o for masculine or a for feminine, which I, once again, there can understand how there would be some confusion, because there really isn't, to my knowledge, a gender-neutral pronoun in the Spanish language. However, I find in any other case of where the person has literally no other reason not to be referring to Chris as their preferred, pronouns of they, them, to be completely inexcusable, because first of all, I think by chapter 5 and having, 71 citations on their wiki page, if I'm correct, that they are indeed using the they, them pronouns, that Chris would be only referred to as they, them, and not mistaken for he, him, or she, her still. Actually, I don't really know if a problem has been seen for she, her, though there's been a lot of people who keep using he, him despite everything. And it's just like, it's 2026, folks. Deltarune has been out for 8 years. Please just stop it. Stop. No, stop. And I also feel like there is a problem itself in theorizing or guessing about, what Chris was before they went by, they, them for their pronouns, because it's not really relevant to the story, first of all, and second of all, doesn't that sort of take away from the fact that Chris already uses they, them pronouns and only identifies by they, them pronouns? If Chris wanted to be referred to as anything else or have their hypothetical past identity talked about, they would have they, them pronouns or he, him, or she, her also too. Hell, we don't even know if humans in Undertale and Deltarune are gendered or not. We could literally just be dealing with the fact that humans naturally do not have the same, mechanics that our own species does. For all we know, they could literally just, mitose? Sorry if you don't get that reference, people. But once again, we don't know if humans actually do even have genders in the Undertale Deltarune universe. So, that whole attempt of, did Chris used to be a boy or did Chris used to be a girl in itself is futile, because we don't even know if a boy and a girl are a thing among humans in Undertale and Deltarune. Frisk also uses they, them pronouns, and Kara has they, them pronouns, but also is referred to with, it occasionally, just because, Kara just has to be different and is more of a force than an actual person in the narrative, I guess. But at the end of the day, I just, would prefer if people, still referred to Rouse as his current confirmed, gender identity and use he, him pronouns, while also giving Chris the dignity of using their preferred pronouns of they, them, because otherwise I just feel like this is all misgendering, and I don't really have any disliking towards the idea that Rouse might transition, but until the day that is confirmed, I just still don't want to be wrong, possibly, and, misgender Rouse. That sounds so weird now that I'm actually saying it. Moving on to the second section of this video, I would like to discuss what I think the next key plot points of chapters 6 and 7 will be, because I believe that we currently have enough evidence between all 5 chapters that are currently released to make out what the next possible 5 chapters will be. And first of all, I would like to elaborate on what I think the Chapter 6 Dark World maybe. And I think that Dark World will be something snow themed. And here are my pieces of evidence. First of all, we know that Noelle might be the person to open up the next Dark World, considering the fact that Noelle will soon find out that her so-called dream was actually real all along. And this may result in Noelle wanting to heal her father, opening up a Dark World so she can bring him to the Dark World and heal him there. Now, this obviously does have problems for the idea of Rudy Knight, and I would like to just confirm now that I will be assuming Death Knight is correct. Now, I know that many of you will not likely be happy with this assumption I'm making, though, I've been a Death Knighter since Chapter 2. December and the Knight were both two very important but absent characters. What do you think I was going to think? That Chris, the person who we control, is going to secretly be the Knight? Yeah, no, I never really subscribed to the Chris Knight theory. Now, based off of what we have already seen from the ARG and the email responses to the inputs, the place where it snowed, Toby very deliberately responded, "You know that isn't until later." Perhaps that the place where it snowed is going to be a dark world in Chapter 6, possibly the final Dark World before the Roaring. And I would like to play a quick game with you real quick. Not a numbers game, but instead a setting game. Now, tell me, what does New Home in Undertale contain? A castle. What does Card Kingdom contain? The first Dark World in Chapter 1 of Deltarune. A castle. Now, we then have the core in Undertale, which is basically Metaton's little, whole district before we get to New Home. And what I do find interesting about that is, in the core, we have, on the genocide route, a transgender allegory going into a second form called Neo to fight a hopeless battle. What does this sound like to you? Ah yes, a Cyber's world in Chapter 2 of Deltarune with Spamton Neo as the secret boss. Oh, right, and both Metaton and Spamton both seek out some form of popularity. For Metaton, it's like literal popularity, and for Spamton, he just wants to be a big shot. Then in Undertale, we have the lab, which is where Metaton shoots all of his shows. Well, I think besides in that one area in the core, but that's besides the point, because in the area where Metaton shoots his show, there is a giant screen. Now, tell me, where else in Deltarune is there a giant screen, or, well, multiple giant screens, and a TV show is shot there? Ah, yes, the Chapter 3 Dark World TV world. And I'd also like to mention that at the very beginning of Hotland and Undertale, Undyne is presence. She sort of, almost melts and dries out to death. While in Deltarune, in TV World, Undyne comes in at the very end to try and fight the Knights, but ultimately fails and is taken to the shelter. See what's going on here? Deltarune isn't necessarily Undertale's narrative in reverse, though it does seem to be the location and themes in reverse. Same with how Chapter 4 Sanctuaries sort of parallel the lore relevance of Undertale's True Lab, and Chapter 5's Dark World sort of mimics Waterfall's somewhat nostalgic feeling with the Echo flowers and whatnot. Oh wait, flowers that echo the past, almost like the 7 flowers in Chapter 5. Yes, that's right. Waterfall is 100% the parallel to Chapter 5's Dark World. By this logic, the next Dark World in Chapter 6 would have to be a snow-themed one, based off of the fact that the second location, just before Waterfall in Undertale, is Snowdin, which, if anybody has ever played Undertale, or ever seen any playthroughs of it, or has even just picked up on the name of it itself, Snowdin is, well, covered in snow. And based off of the 10th anniversary stream, and also the alarm clock dialogue, the holidays lived in Snowdin in Undertale. Of course, this is their alternate reality counterparts for Undertale from Deltarune, but whatever. The point is that Snowden inherently has not just Chapter 6 ties, but also holiday ties. Holiday as in the Holiday family, of course. So, where else would it be better to be for both the knight's identity to be unveiled, for Noelle to make, and for the roaring to start in, than in a snow-themed Chapter 6 Dark World? And the reason why I say the roaring happening in Chapter 6 is because of the fact that I believe that in Chapter 7, we will be venturing down to the shelter. Why, you may ask? Because the shelter is, well, a bomb shelter. And you want to know why anybody would ever use a bomb shelter? In case of an emergency. Now, I believe that an emergency like the, well, roaring, because I think the apocalypse would be treated as an emergency, don't you think? The shelter would be opened, and since we have the 3 different codes, Father Alvin would have to input his code, and then Carol would have to put in her code as mayor. However, the police key, which was held by Asgore and presumably Undyne, would only be available to us. Would you like to know why? Because Asgore and Undyne are currently trapped in the shelter with the knights. Well, more of the knight is trapped in the shelter with Undyne and Asgore, but we'll get to that later. However, based off of Chapter 5's ending, now Chris and Susie know the shelter code for the police. So, I guess now we have all the 3 required shelter codes in case of said emergency. Now, I'd like to tell you a story of exactly what I think will happen next. Not necessarily exactly, this will be going through major plot points. Chapter 6 takes off the morning after we left off in Chapter 5. Susie and Chris meet up somewhere, probably school because it will likely be a Monday. Now, once there, Susie and Chris will likely go tell Noelle and also likely Birdley about the truth of the Dark Worlds. After this occurs, they will likely show them the closet Dark World leading to Castletown. That will be where we get to exchange in our final dark crystal to make that gosh darn pure crystal. However, eventually we notice that something is wrong. Susie calls out for Noelle, wondering where she is, but Noelle is nowhere to be seen. So you, Susie, and Birdley leave the Castletown before heading out back to the hospital to go see where Noelle is. However, by the time we get into the hospital room where Rudy rests, we notice that there is a dark smoke coming from the room. Noelle has opened the Dark World to a new winter wonderland. Once we enter this winter wonderland, we are given a Snowden-like landscape in which we have a winter forest with dark trees and snow all covering the ground. However, by the time we get back to Noelle, she seems a bit distraught. It seems that Rudy has gone somewhere. She seems to have been separated from him when the Dark World first opened. The rest of the chapter will revolve around trying to find Rudy wherever he is. You know, kind of like one of those Where is Waldo puzzles from when you were young, but now instead of trying to find a guy in striped clothing, you're trying to find your vessel's best friend's, well, terminally ill father who is currently in this dream world and nobody knows where the hell he is. Eventually, after some sort of, Christmas-themed boss or something, maybe Santa, who knows, we find Rudy, who unfortunately is on his last leg. He gets in one final word to Noelle before sadly passing away and turning to dust. However, the knight has seen all of this, and the knight, which I'm going off of here, is Des, and starts a battle with the party the second that Susie tries to attack the knight. But the problem is now, the knight does not want to keep this going anymore. She just lost her father, and now she's fighting her sister, and she's been plotting with her mother this entire time. Everything December has is almost gone. If she continues this fight any longer, she risks hurting her sister, one of the last things she has left to go back to. So what December does is exit the fight in a cutscene as always, because what else can the knight do but win by cutscene? And out of nowhere, several of the knight's swords plunge into the ground, opening more and more dark fountains inside of that dark fountain, causing what else but the roaring. And as the final roaring fountain opens, the knight outstretches its hands, causing Chris to throw away their soul, our soul, the player's soul, as Chris slowly follows the knights forward into that final dark fountain. Oh, right. I almost forgot that I was going to say this, but I fully believe that Chris will betray the party in the end. So we shall move on to Chapter 7. Shortly after this, Susie, Noelle, and Birdley run back to hometown in a panic. But when they get there, they see that somehow, despite almost everyone else having turned to stone in terms of darkness, Rouse is still there. That's because he's a Titan. Oh yeah, right, I forgot to also specify the fact that Rouse is probably a Titan. Anyway, back to the story. Now that we have Rouse, Susie is also still carrying the player soul because she believes that's going to be relevant or something. And Susie also knows the shelter code for the police. So by the time that Susie, Carol, and also Father Alvin get together and put in all the shelter codes, all of Hometown comes flooding through the shelter's gates and runs into there, where they find Asgore and also Undyne, who seemingly have been through hell, but, I mean, they're still here, right? They venture way, way deeper down into the shelter. The people of Hometown venture way, way deeper down to the shelter, as they are guided by Undyne and Asgore, who are pretty well experienced in venturing down there from the fact that they've spent, well, in Asgore's case, the last day down there, and in Undyne's case, the last, 3 days? Once they enter the meat factory, they free the captured Onion Son, and as they try to leave, they see something. A small, grayscale, lifeless form huddled in the corner. Susie gets an idea. This looks like Chris, right? And this red soul thing that she picked up from Chris sort of looks like it would fit in there, right? So she puts the player soul, which she's been carrying around for this entire time, into what turns out to be the vessel. Yes, that's right. We are going to be controlling the vessel from now on, which was always our true designated cage with human soul and parts. Now, there's a crashing heard from above. The Titans are on the loose above the shelter, as slowly the light world is turned into the dark world. And, well, somebody needs to stay back and try to hold off the Titans. So I'm guessing a lot of the original cast of Undertale, like Torio, Papyrus, Undyne, Asgore, all that jazz, will likely be staying behind to try and fight off the Titans for as long as possible, until eventually the heroes can stop it all, which is what they're hoping. So the vessel, Susie, Noelle, Birdley, and Rouse all go down back to Chapter 6's Dark World, where they then go into the Dark World, inside of that Dark World, inside of that Dark World, inside of that Dark World, into a freefall until they end up into the depths. And once in the depths, they fight the knights, which actually somehow manages to beat them all. The problem is that the knight happened to just be too strong at that point. Death's determination had grown to a point of where she could no longer be stopped, and she had grown too strong. However, as the vessel held on to their hopes and dreams, they called out for help, and somebody came. Azrael, who was coming home from college right as the roaring happened and was kind of confused by it all, just happened to sort of chill, and I don't know, just because he's sort of the main character on all, I guess, is just already insanely powerful, and goes back down to the depths after he sees the vessel and whatnot going down there. And once he gets down there, he aids the party and basically saves them from the knights, who finally unmasks herself as December. And as we begin to think that's finally all over, the screen goes black, and a white slash goes across it. Suddenly, December is swoon, as Chris steps out of the shadow. Now fully intent on fulfilling their promise, Chris raises their new blade, and when Azrael tries to stop Chris from attacking anymore, Chris swoons Azrael too, opening a fight. Any attempt at attacking Chris is basically futile. They will parry any attack, or just straight up dodge it. Chris cannot be pacified either. Their determination is too high to simply be, put down that easily. So instead, you must try to spare them. But once you fill up their spare meter, they resist it. They refuse to be spared. Not now, not after everything they've done. They've come too far and done too many things just to give up now. So, Chris swoons, Birdly, then moves on to Susie, who they also swoon. Then Noelle, she attempts to use Healing Prayer. And then they move on to the vessel. Oh, the vessel, containing the soul that has controlled Chris and ruined their life for the last week. They attack the vessel, swooning us over and over and over again to the point of where the damage modifier overflows with 9s. The vessel itself is chopped to pieces, leaving only the red soul behind. And then it's down to Rousey. But Rousey refuses to let this end this way. He too has waited far too long and has worked far too hard just for the prophecy to still happen. Rousey harnesses all of his memories, all of his times on the adventures with Chris and Susie. And then he tries to make Chris remember all of the good times, remember all the times they spent with their friends happy in the dark world. And this, well, it finally works. Chris just lets go. Chris stops fighting. Chris is spared. But they realize that all they've done now is just hurt their friends. And the world itself is ending now. So, what Chris does is the only thing that they know will work. They take back the player soul one last time. And then they use it to seal the depths. Yes, the depths itself. And, well, the residents of the Dark Worlds are saved. They're no longer turned to stone anymore. The light world is finally, unroaring, basically. The roaring itself is over. And now, well, Chris realizes that they may have to say goodbye. The battle itself did a number on them, and given the fact that they were just without their soul in the Dark World for an extended period of time, well, they're definitely worse for wear. So, and, well, one last action, Chris just hugs Rousey, in sort of a mirror image to what we see at the end of Undertale. And, well, Chris asks for Rousey to forgive him, and once again, in mirror fashion, Rousey does. And that is Deltarune. I don't know, roll credits or something. That was my very terrible interpretation of what might happen next. Please excuse me for that. That was probably terrible. But if anybody wants, I'll make a Carol Knight or Rudy Knight version of it, or basically any other sort of thing, like if you ask me in the comments down below. So that was the video, guys. I hope y'all were okay with listening to me ramble for however long this video is. It's probably over half an hour. It's probably my longest video yet. So have a great day, y'all, and see you later.